If I could have your attention, please. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Indonesia Update. I'm Greg Feely with Ronit Ricci. We are the co-conveners of the Update. It's my great pleasure to introduce one of the doyens of Indonesian studies at ANU, someone very warmly regarded by the entire community of Indonesianists, not only in Canberra but in Australia, Emeritus Professor Virginia Hooker, to welcome you formally to the conference.
Selamat pagi para hadirin yang kami hormati. Good morning, everyone. Yang terhormat, Ibu Julie Heckscher, Bapak-bapak dan Ibu-ibu yang kami hormati, selamat datang di Indonesia Update yang ke-36. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our Indonesia Update for our alumni, and a special welcome for those here for the first time. I'd like to welcome people from the schools in particular. We're very thrilled that you have come. Pertama-tama kita menghormati orang asli Australia, orang yang sekarang minoritas di negara mereka sendiri. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay our respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. I'll just wait for a few to sit down. So this is our 36th Indonesia Update. The first was held in November 1983 with the theme Current Developments in Indonesia. It was the brainchild of Dr. Peter Macaulay, then director of the ANU's Indonesia project, and 150 people, the records say, attended. Peter and the late Professor Jamie Mackey, mainly Peter I think at that time, made a case to the Department of Foreign Affairs that there was a need for professional, up-to-date analyses of recent events in Indonesia. DFAT agreed, and we remain grateful for what has become a long-term partnership. At the ANU end, the update has been sustained by the work and leadership of people we know well. Hal Hill, Chris Manning, Anne Booth, Jim Fox, Ross McLeod, Liz Drysdale, Budi Reso Sudarmo, and Blaine Lewis. All of them worked with colleagues in Indonesia to ensure the update will always be a partnership between Australians and Indonesians. The two conveners of this year's update are Ronit Ricci of the ANU and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Greg Feely of the Department of Political and Social Change. The update theme, developed in collaboration with the Update Organising Committee, is Contentious Belongings, the Place of Minorities in Indonesia. Now, that first update attracted 150. Registrations for this update closed at 510, a capacity crowd. Videos and audio podcasts of this and recent updates take it beyond our meeting here and keep it available online. And the book of last year's update, you can buy it now. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this year's theme of minorities reflects one of the deep-seated concerns of Indonesia's leaders and politicians, the challenge of how to maintain Indonesia's unity in the face of its ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity. A few weeks ago, I was at an international meeting in Jakarta, opened by Indonesia's Foreign Minister, Her Excellency Ibu Retno Marsudi. In the context of creating an open and tolerant society, she pointed to Indonesia's national ideology, which you know, Pancasila, as the key to unity and to preserving rights. Pancasila provides the framework for national stability and national values, and its fifth pillar, as we perhaps know, is social justice for all Indonesians. Indonesia's social justice and social welfare groups are acutely aware of the protection this pillar can offer Indonesian minorities, its most vulnerable people. I think we can take a nation's pulse. We can check its state of health by analysing its treatment of minorities, and the update speakers will be doing just that. It might interest you to note that in Australia, the overwhelming majority of complaints to the Human Rights Commission concern disability. What does that tell us about Australian society? In Indonesia, general awareness of the national ideology and its values is high. Politicians and administrators refer often to Pancasila rhetoric, but it is members of civil society who actually put it into action. Now, Indonesia's grassroots and social welfare NGOs are impressive because of the dedication of their members and their commitment to their fellow citizens. The mass social organisations of Nahdlatul Ulama, the NU, and Muhammadiyah have particularly effective human resource development arms. For example, the Research and Human Resources Development section of NU's Central Board recently published the results of its research into the protection of minorities. Their conclusions are that inclusive, transparent government at regional level can support minorities by delivering the same services and opportunities to all citizens, not just some of them. Now, not all minorities need protection, although most seek recognition. Some ethnic groups are proud of their minority status and see it as strengthening their special identity. Others, like the Samin movement in Java, the subject of a longitudinal study by ANU's Amri Widodo, have made a conscious decision to withdraw from mainstream Javanese life and develop their own style of life and culture. As a result, the Samin feel a sense of power and agency. The dynamics of the interaction between these kinds of minorities with the majority are instructive about how difference might be mutually acknowledged and respected. I suggest that minorities are not defined by numbers. Rather, they are defined by attitudes of minorities to themselves, as well as the attitudes of majorities. While at a Jakarta conference last month, Dr. Farid Ishak, Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Johannesburg, argued that it is essential to ensure the human rights of all minorities for at least two reasons. One is ethics and compassion, and the other is that if the rights of minorities are guaranteed, then all members of society are protected. Unless the collective rights of all members of society are secure, he emphasised, no member, minority or majority, is entirely safe. So our 36th update would not be possible without the ongoing support of the following: the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to whom we are very grateful. Here at ANU, the Indonesia Project, the Department of Political and Social Change, and the Crawford School. My personal thanks to Kate, Nur Kamala, and Lydia of the Indonesia Project. So let's get going. I am delighted to welcome Ms. Julie Heckscher, First Assistant Secretary, Southeast Asia Division, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who will chair our first session. And I now invite her to open this 36th Indonesia update using our heritage ceremonial update gong. Thank you, Julie. So this is where I get worried that I'm going to break that. Go for it, Julie. Okay.
Okay, so the gong survived, so that was fortunate. So thank you, Virginia. It gives me, absolute pleasure to be here chairing and opening the first session of this year's Indonesia project. I have to say, listening to the opening comments by Virginia, I was impressed by the decision that was made so many years ago by DFAT to actually fund the Indonesia project. As early as, back in the 80s, there was a recognition of the importance of Indonesia to Australia. And I think this past fortnight has shown that in really sort of a very evident way. Our Prime Minister Morrison, made his very first overseas trip to Indonesia, and he did it within a week of being sworn in. And I think the fact that he did that, and the fact that he had such a comprehensive program, such a comprehensive welcome from President Widodo, shows the strength of the relationship, the commitment on both sides, and the recognition of how important it is to all of us. They basically presided over the announcement that the partnership between Australia and Indonesia would now be a comprehensive strategic partnership. And they announced the conclusion of IASEPA, well, that's what we call it anyway, which is the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership as well. There were a few other things signed, but those were the really significant things that were done during what was a very early and really important first visit for Prime Minister Morrison. I think it's really hard to see that there is any more important and more significant symbol of how important the relationship is to us and the strength of the engagement that we need to keep going. The Indonesia project is, of course, for us a very important part of the way that we understand, inform ourselves, talk about, discuss, analyse the relationship and what's going on in Indonesia. It's been running for 54 years and it continues from strength to strength. I think every year the number of participants has been growing and it was over capacity this year. So that's a great testament to what the Indonesia project is doing for Australia-Indonesia discussions and for analysis here of Indonesia. We've been supporting the Indonesia project since the 1980s. That is really something that is a big commitment for us and it's important for us and we're really pleased to do it. It says a lot about the value we place on the Indonesia project and the discussions you have here and on the value we place on knowing more, understanding more, talking more about Indonesia. Of course, my role here is really only to introduce our speakers, to keep them on time and then to sort of get questions. I'm going to sort of get straight down to it. So our speaker today, Tom Power, would be well known to many of you in this room. He commenced his PhD at the ANU's Department of Political and Social Change in 2014 and was awarded an Endeavour Research Scholarship in 2015. His PhD research looks at the effects of alternation in government upon Indonesia's post-authoritarian political parties, with a particular focus on political patronage and party change. He's conducted extensive fieldwork in Indonesia and has delivered academic presentations at a diverse range of institutions, including the Asian Studies Association of Australia, the Melbourne Centre for Indonesian Law, Islam and Society, and the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. So welcome, Tom. So likewise, our discussant, Jacqui Baker, will be well known within Indonesianist circles, both in Australia and internationally. She's currently a lecturer in Southeast Asian politics at Murdoch University and a research fellow at the Asia Research Centre. Her work examines the significance of the police and policing to political and economic regimes in Southeast Asia, and she's currently writing a book on the changes to the police force after Indonesia's reformasi. So welcome, Jacqui. And now I'm going to hand you over to Tom, and you'll see me next handing him cards if he's running over time.
Thank you very much, Julia, and good morning, everybody. On the 21st of May this year, Indonesia marked 2 decades since its longtime autocrat Suharto stepped down, and it embarked on this transition towards democracy. And some of the really important achievements of the reformasi period that are going to be relevant to political events that I discussed today included the opening up of competitive elections and avenues for democratic opposition, the withdrawal of the military from politics, the decentralization of state power, and the liberalization of civil society. Indonesia emerged as a leading success story in democracy's third wave. And these democratic achievements have been particularly noteworthy in a context of global democratic recession over the past decade or so, where the number of democratic countries around the world has declined. But as regular attendees of the update will know, more somber analyses of Indonesian democracy have arisen over the past decade as well, especially since Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's second term. And despite optimism around Jokowi's ascent to the presidency, particularly because he defeated an openly authoritarian challenger in Prabowo Subianto, we have continued to see an even more pronounced decline in the quality of Indonesian democracy since he took office. At the end of 2017, the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index showed Indonesia suffering its sharpest annual drop since records began in 2006. But for all that democratic government has declined in Indonesia, it's important to say that it has not fallen into a category of competitive authoritarianism, where opposition is systematically repressed or undermined, and checks and balances on executive power are eroded. Comparatively speaking, Indonesia is much better placed than, for instance, Vladimir Putin's Russia or Erdogan's Turkey. And we have certainly not seen the large-scale violent human rights abuses of Duterte in the Philippines. And it's worth pointing out that problems of democratic erosion are, of course, not limited to new democracies. One of them's in prison already. We can only hope. And of course, when we look to 2018, it's particularly important to analyse how this process of democratic regression has continued and what changes have come about this year that may better help us to understand the situation in Indonesian democracy at the present time. The first thing to say is that in 2018, this pattern of democratic deterioration has continued. And in reviewing the political developments this year, I will be emphasising three key trends. First, the continued trend towards greater political accommodation of very conservative and intolerant expressions of political Islam. Second, the government's instrumental use of powerful state institutions, particularly those of law enforcement and security, for narrow partisan purposes ahead of the 2019 election. And third, an upturn in the government's efforts to undermine and repress constitutionally legitimate and democratic opposition. So even though Indonesia remains an electoral democracy, and we should be optimistic that the 2019 elections will be relatively free and fair, I will argue that, under the Jokowi government, we have seen an authoritarian turn taking place in 2018, which has challenged democratic norms of pluralistic competition, free organisation of opposition, and the political neutrality of the state security services. And that this is evidence of this authoritarian turn within Jokowi's presidency. So today I'll start by reflecting on the important patterns that we've seen emerging in Indonesian politics since the election in Jakarta last year, which saw an incumbent defeated through sectarian mobilization and religiously charged campaigns. I'll then look at two of the marquee political events of 2018. Firstly, the simultaneous elections in June, and secondly, the presidential nominations in August. And in each case, I'll touch on what I see as the big picture implications of these events. And I'll then return to this theme of an authoritarian turn in Jokowi's government. I'll address what it entails and what its implications may be. And finally, I will consider the lead up to the 2019 elections in this context of democratic decline. As you recall, during the 2017 Jakarta gubernatorial election, hundreds of thousands of Muslim protesters descended on the capital to participate in a series of mass rallies which accused the ethnic Chinese Christian governor Ahok of blaspheming against Islam. A diverse collection of groups participated, but they were united in demanding Ahok's electoral disqualification, arrest, and imprisonment. And these mobilizations shaped the election according to issues of religious identity, rather than Ahok's bureaucratic reform or programmatic achievement. As you will recall, the government succumbed to the protesters' demands and allowed Ahok to be brought to trial, which would end in a 2-year prison term. What's more, he was defeated in the election by Anies Baswedan and Sandiaga Uno, who were backed by two national opposition parties, Prabowo's Gerindra and the Islamic PKS, and who aligned themselves to the Islamist mobilization during the campaign. After the Jakarta election, we saw the emergence of three important patterns. The first of these was an effort by opposition forces to perpetuate the sectarian mobilization and polarization that had swung the Jakarta election. For the parties that had supported Anies and Sandiaga, as well as the so-called 212 movement of Islamist organizations that had participated in the rallies, the use of religious polarization and sectarian campaigns were seen as a strategy for winning elections in 2018, and even for challenging Jokowi in 2019. They sought to construct the Jokowi government as anti-Islamic, so as to oblige pious Muslims to support the oppositional axis. And one example of this was a statement by senior politician Amin Rais, a vocal 212 supporter. He famously contrasted parties of Setan, those are PDIP, Nasdem and Golkar, which had supported Ahok and comprised the core of Jokowi's coalition, with the parties of God that had opposed Ahok and broadly opposed the government. The second big post-Ahok trend has been the government's efforts to prevent the snowballing of sectarian polarization by developing stronger links to Islamic constituents and stronger religious credentials. In particular, we have seen this accommodation of more mainstream Islamic organizations and clerics, although many of them are still very conservative in their doctrinal outlook. Most notably, the government has sought to reach out to Indonesia's largest Islamic organization, Nahdlatul Ulama. And this has been achieved through offers of state patronage as well as doctrinal endorsement. The government has also wooed powerful clerics, such as NU President and the chair of the Indonesian Council of Islamic Scholars, Ma'ruf Amin, who was a prominent figure in the anti-Ahok campaign, overseeing a fatwa which deemed Ahok a blasphemer and testifying against him at his trial. Jokowi has gone to great lengths to secure an alliance with Ma'ruf. In the words of one senior NU intellectual, Jokowi realized that Kiai Ma'ruf is a politician too. So whatever Kiai Ma'ruf asked for, Jokowi gave him. The government facilitated him. This way, Kiai Ma'ruf is comfortable and Jokowi is comfortable. They have grown closer and closer, and now NU is always behind the government. There are arguably two patterns at play here. One is simple co-optation of Jokowi, by Jokowi, of potential opponents. But the other is the promotion of people who have previously espoused very illiberal and even anti-pluralist attitudes into positions of prominence and influence within the administration. Whether or not they will be able to exert influence over the government's ideological direction remains to be seen. The third post-ad hoc pattern has been the government's efforts to repress the more radical or intransigent elements of the Islamist mobilization. This included bringing criminal charges against a number of figures involved in the 212 movement. But it also involved the issuing of a highly restrictive decree on mass organizations that allowed it to disband groups which it considers anti-Pancasila. As you may recall, the transnational Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir was the first to be banned last year. And the upshot of these more repressive policies has been the reinforcement of an Islamic narrative, or an Islamist narrative, of the Jokowi government as being dictatorial and anti-Islam. Now, the first marquee political event this year were the subnational elections in June. Traditionally, Pilkada subnational elections have revolved around local issues. But this year, there was a view shared by national-level opposition politicians and politicians in government that the elections would provide some indication of the effectiveness of these three post-ad hoc strategies. In particular, there was an open question of whether religious polarization of the sort seen in Jakarta would re-emerge. Some elections were shaped by religious polarization, but these were mostly in regions where religious and ethnic cleavages have long affected electoral politics. In short, there was little evidence to suggest national-level dynamics were systematically shaping and reshaping existing patterns of political allegiance and mobilization at the grassroots. And generally speaking, the opposition party's strategy of playing on religious polarization was unsuccessful. One reason for this was the failure of Gerindra, PKS, and PAN to effectively consolidate their coalition and nominate strong candidates in the key elections on Java. But another reason was the efforts of popular nationalist candidates to enhance their religious credentials. And this mostly involved choosing an Islamic running mate, obtaining support from Islamic parties, and distributing patronage to Muslim organizations. Strategies which may not be new, but which took on a new and more overt tone during these elections, and which mirrored the strategies adopted by Jokowi at the national level. One such nationalist candidate was Central Java's Governor Ganjar Pranowo, standing for a second term. And he was clearly aware of the threat of religious polarization. Even though he was running as a PDIP incumbent in the party's Central Java heartland, he took as his running mate the relatively unknown son of senior cleric and P3 grandee Maimun Zubair. He explained it in this way: running with an Islamic politician helps prevent identity politics such as we saw in Jakarta from emerging in Central Java. This is not just my preference, it's in line with PDIP's strategy. The political situation is no longer as it was in 2013 when I could win with a fellow PDIP cadre. It is now safer to have a nationalist Islamic pairing. Even though Jakarta-style sectarianism did not play out, the intermixing of religion and electoral politics in Indonesia's largest provinces actually appeared stronger than ever. What's more, despite the overall success of these accommodative rainbow coalition strategies, the elections in West and Central Java still provided a reminder of the political effectiveness of Islamic groups not represented on the winning ticket. In both provinces, rank outsiders nominated by opposition parties, Gerindra, PKS and PAN, were able to dramatically boost their votes in the dying days of the campaign. These late surges are illustrated here in green. And as you can see, in both cases, we saw more than a doubling of the expected outcome for those opposition-backed candidates in the last week leading up to the polling day. It seems that Islamic political machines did much of the heavy lifting in both provinces, and that despite the frontrunners' selection of Islamic running mates, religious messaging proved very effective. In short, these late swings could not generate victories, but they provided further evidence, further confirmation of the political influence and mobilizational capacity of Islamic networks in Java, the key provinces, the key battlegrounds for 2019. Much attention leading up to the Pilkada was focused on this potential for sectarian polarization. But at the periphery of the news cycle, another problem for democratic quality played out at the local level. This was the continued growth of single-ticket elections, elections in which only one candidate pair is nominated and so runs against an empty column. These tend to result from all-inclusive coalitions being formed between nominating parties or from the legal disqualification of registered candidates. And the argument has been advanced that in either case, these elections reflect a new stage in the consolidation of elite dominance at the local level, rather than overwhelming popular support for a particular public figure. And indeed, in the 2018 Makassar mayoral election, this man, Munafri Arifuddin, became the first single-ticket candidate to lose to the empty column, which I think suggests a deeply dysfunctional electoral process and significant problems around representation and electoral accountability. And this was not a unique phenomenon. My apologies. Electoral backlash against single tickets was also visible in other parts of the country. Not only did the overall proportion of single ticket nominations rise to more than 10% of elections conducted at the municipal and regency level in 2018, we also saw a growing number of competitive votes between single tickets and the empty column. In fact, the empty column received more than 30% of the vote in a third of this year's single ticket elections. So at the subnational level this year, we saw the growing accommodation of quite conservative Islamic politics by popular pluralist politicians, as well as the continued subversion of open and competitive elections at the local level. Both trends, I think, serve to illustrate a narrowing of electoral choice at the ballot box. And interestingly, both trends resonated with developments at the national level during the second big political event of 2018, the presidential nominations. For the first time in April 2019, the presidential and parliamentary elections will be held on the same day. Previously, the presidential election has been held about 3 months after the legislative ballot, and presidential nomination coalitions only established once legislative votes and seats have been tallied. But this time, presidential nominations have taken place a full 8 months out from the election, and would-be candidates have spent much of the year attempting to boost their nomination credentials. As we can see here, and thanks to Mas Burhan for this graph, Prabowo has remained the only potential challenger to enjoy a sizable base of support, even though he's been trailing Jokowi by a large margin in 2018. So it's probably unsurprising, given the gap between their polling numbers, that Prabowo has proven hesitant and non-committal in the lead-up to nominations. The closest he came to declaring his candidacy was a Gerindra party meeting in April, when he said he would run, quote, in the event that Gerindra instructs me to. Of course, Prabowo is the only person in Gerindra who can issue such an instruction. Our own Liam Gammon at New Mandala commented that Prabowo's language left the door wide open for other scenarios that might remain on his mind. One such scenario was a joint ticket with Jokowi. In fact, even as he told his party that he was prepared to stand, Prabowo was in the midst of negotiations with Jokowi's chief political fixer, Luhut Panjaitan, about the potential for him to run as Jokowi's vice president. The prospect of a single ticket presidential election, which was being taken seriously by some elites in Jakarta at the start of this year, seems to have been quite attractive to both Jokowi and Prabowo. Indeed, the eventual stumbling block to a Jokowi-Prabowo ticket was reportedly disagreement over the distribution of cabinet spoils. So, what are the broader implications of the shift to a simultaneous format in 2019? First, only parties that won seats in the 2014 election are able to nominate presidential tickets, and only a coalition representing 20% or more of the legislature is able to nominate a pair. This means that new and extra parliamentary parties have no leverage over the nomination process, despite the fact that they're participating in the elections. Second, there's an expectation among party elites and that presidential campaigns will be more party-oriented than they were over previous elections, because they will be conducted in tandem with the legislative campaign. And of course, this implies a stronger coattail effect than in previous elections, because presidential and parliamentary votes will be taking place on the same day. Party leaders expect that these coattail effects will boost the legislative vote for parties that are closely associated with a particular presidential candidate. And this meant that parties squabbled over vice presidential nominations in the lead up to the August registration. Not only did they try to get their own candidates on a ticket, but they also tried to prevent other parties in their coalition from getting a VP nomination. Fourth, and really importantly, the time from the submission of presidential nominations until voting day is 8 months, compared to just 2 months in 2014. A longer campaign means greater campaign costs, and both tickets will need huge amounts of money in order to keep up. So once again, the pattern of support for the two candidates in the parliament encouraged the assembly of just two coalitions. Jokowi had declared support from a majority of parties ahead of the nominations, and indeed quite early on in the year, and ultimately, parties that were not supportive of Jokowi congealed behind Prabowo once again. After much hesitation, Prabowo committed to stand. So let's take a look at the two presidential tickets. Jokowi had three main concerns ahead of nomination. First, he wanted to find the most electable running mate. This was his primary agenda in the search for a vice presidential nominee. And to this end, he communicated obsessively with pollsters and followed surveys very closely throughout the year. Second, Jokowi wanted to limit his vulnerability to sectarian campaigns, and this enhanced the prospects that he would choose a prominent Islamic figure. And finally, Jokowi sought to maintain his coalition and prevent any defections at the last minute. So, to this end, he delayed declaring his vice presidential nominee until absolutely the last minute, the day before registrations closed. So who were the main contenders for this VP nomination? First was Yusuf Kala, the incumbent, but he was unable to wrangle legal dispensation from the Constitutional Court to run for a third term. Other candidates included business tycoons, military men, and party elites. But ultimately, the two strongest names were of NU-linked figures: the former Constitutional Court Chief Justice, Mahfud MD, and Ma'ruf Amin. And Jokowi chose Mahfud. He had electoral strength, he had good NU credentials, he had administrative experience, and he had a moderate political outlook. 2 days before nominations closed, Jokowi's choice was leaked to the media. Jokowi Mahfud campaign materials started circulating online, and Mahfud, true to form, started giving interviews about his upcoming nomination. Yet when Jokowi arranged a final meeting with his coalition partners to rubber stamp the ticket, he faced a rebellion. At the 11th hour, 4 key parties refused to endorse Mahfud and pushed for Ma'ruf instead, and Jokowi backed down. When the nominations were announced and registered, we had the Jokowi-Ma'ruf ticket. So why did Jokowi's coalition reject his preferred running mate? The first reason was scheming for 2024. Mahfud's relative youth, he's 61, and popularity made him a strong contender for the 2024 election when the parties hoped to secure the palace for one of their own members. Second, Mahfud had developed an anti-party reputation, particularly for PDIP, for changes to the electoral system that he had overseen during his tenure as Constitutional Court Chief Justice. Third, Mahfud was close to non-party volunteer groups, which party leaders treat with suspicion. In particular, he was well liked by the so-called Ahokers, and Jokowi's coalition wanted to distance itself from that particular constituency. Fourth, despite his NU background, Mahfud was rejected by NU leaders in favour of Ma'ruf. Indeed, they publicly disowned Mahfud and threatened to withdraw their support for Jokowi unless a more prominent representative of the organisation was selected. And fifth, there was an element of spite here. The parties didn't like the fact that Jokowi had tried to present his decision as a fait accompli. But ultimately, by bowing to pressure on the issue of his running mate, Jokowi was made to look weak and beholden to party bosses, much as had been the case in 2014. This was exactly the situation that he had wanted to avoid. And Ma'ruf's selection also disappointed many of Jokowi's non-Muslim and pluralist supporters, who remembered his involvement in the Ahok case. What about Prabowo's ticket? In the last month prior to nomination, Prabowo's intention to run finally firmed. But his coalition margins were much finer than Jokowi's. And another major problem was the lack of financial clout. Prabowo was famously an oligarch, but he'd spent much of his wealth in 2014, and both Gerindra and PKS had been excluded from central government during Jokowi's first term. This lack of access to government meant it was very difficult for Prabowo to recoup his campaign expenses. And thus, his search for a running mate had to balance electability, the need for resources, and the fragility of his coalition. Once again, we saw a range of comparatively well-known and popular nominees pushing their names towards Prabowo. But PKS and PAN were also keen to boost their legislative votes by taking advantage of this coattail effect, and they pushed forward less prominent but high-ranking cadres from their own parties. And then, in late July, Islamic elites close to the 212 movement held a gathering of Islamic scholars which confirmed Prabowo as its chosen president, but proposed the conservative cleric Abdul Somad and the PKS leader Salim Segaf as vice presidential nominees. And finally, the spoiler, SBY entered the fray. He offered to supplement Prabowo's campaign costs if he took Agus Yudhoyono, his son, as his vice presidential running mate. Predictably, Prabowo's established PKS and 212 allies were strongly against the selection of Agus. And this left Prabowo in a quandary. Should he accept the cash offered by Yudhoyono, or the less well-resourced and less electable candidates chosen by the remnant of the 212 constituency? Like Jokowi, Prabowo delayed his decision until the last minute. He was uncomfortable ceding influence to SBY, but knew that Salim and Somad did not appeal to centrist voters. Finally, he settled on a left-field choice, the Deputy Governor of Jakarta, Sandiaga Uno. Under the circumstances, this was not a bad move. Sandiaga has money to support the campaign, he's certainly energetic, and he's associated with Prabowo's own Gerindra party, meaning Prabowo did not need to choose between his coalition allies. Ultimately, PKS, PAN, and Democrat all signed off on the candidate registration. Prabowo had dodged the bullet of intervention in the campaign from Yudhoyono, but he'd also managed to maintain the support of his core constituents. So what are the broader implications of these nominations? Well, first and most obviously, they show that without a party of his own, Jokowi still struggles in his interactions with his coalition backers. But what's more, they seem to confirm the post-Ahok trend that we saw in the Pilkada, where even very popular nationalist figures try to strengthen their religious credentials and shield themselves from sectarian attacks by pairing up with Islamic running mates. And whereas the choice of Ma'ruf did disappoint some of Jokowi's most committed pluralist supporters, it's not clear that it will improve his prospects of capturing conservative Islamic votes. Indeed, the narrative from Prabowo supporters simply paints Ma'ruf's nomination as cynical co-optation. Vote for a president chosen by clerics, not a cleric chosen by the president. In the last few years, we've heard some compelling analyses of Jokowi's approach to the presidency and his relationship with Indonesian democracy. For example, Jacqui Baker and Eve Warburton have both described Jokowi as a developmentalist. His central concern is delivering economic development, and he is basically ambivalent towards social and political reform more broadly. More to the point, he has little in the way of a coherent ideological position or a big picture political agenda. In essence, where Jokowi has acted in an illiberal or anti-democratic manner, it's the product of short-term thinking and ad hoc decision-making. But in the lead up to the 2019 election, Jokowi's haphazard approach to dealing with political challenges has created some very dangerous precedents for Indonesian democracy. Efforts to consolidate his political position have actually started to encroach upon fundamental democratic norms and indeed on core achievements of Indonesia's reformasi. Three strategies that have been introduced or intensified in 2018 are of particular importance. And in each case, elements of the state apparatus, law enforcement and the security services are being employed, instrumentalized in service to partisan politics and in the context of a democratic election campaign. The first issue involves what seems an increasingly systematic effort by government elites to use the law enforcement apparatus as a means of coercing obedience and support from opposition politicians. We have seen quite open and public threats from power brokers like Luhut Panjaitan to expose the sins of the government's critics. The implication is that evidence of criminality and the threat of prosecution are being used as leverage over the administration's political opponents. This is not a new phenomenon, but we are seeing an upsurge in its scale, intensity, and partisan orientation in the lead up to next year's elections. Informants often associate this with the fact that the Attorney General, Prasetyo, is a Nasdem politician rather than a non-partisan appointee. In recent months, we have seen multiple opposition party elites, including a party chairman in Haritanu and a growing number of regional leaders, either publicly switch allegiance to the government or distance themselves from their own parties. And in many of these instances, the widely circulating interpretation is that the threat of investigation and prosecution was essential to their realignment. The upshot here is the more systematic subordination of the rule of law to partisan political agendas. The second issue, I believe, is even more concerning for the state of Indonesian democracy. In early 2018, while the identity of Jokowi's presidential challenger remained unclear, the social media hashtag 2019 Ganti Presiden, or 2019 Change the President, began circulating after it was posted by a number of politicians and celebrities. Within a few months, this hashtag had spawned a burgeoning political movement with a strong online presence, its own branded clothing and merchandise, and a formal organizational structure. The group held a number of peaceful assemblies in Jakarta and several other cities in the first part of the year. But 2019 GP organizers received frequent reports that police were confiscating merchandise from sellers and intimidating people displaying the hashtag. Since June, scheduled 2019 GP events across the country have been refused permission to assemble or broken up by the police, often assisted by pro-government counter-protesters. Following a particularly confrontational police and counter-protester disbandment of a 2019 GP event in Surabaya, Luhut argued that activities of the GP movement should be banned so as to avert social discord and clashes between pro-government and opposition demonstrators. As Markus Mitzner has written, the Jokowi government clamped down on illiberal and anti-democratic groups such as Hizb ut-Tahrir, using the illiberal and repressive instrument of the mass organization's decree. But the repression of 2019 GP is different. The group does not have anti-system objectives, and its goal is the electoral defeat of Jokowi. It has gone to great pains to show that it is a legitimate constitutional expression of opposition, and the government has presented no evidence to the contrary. This is troubling, as it threatens to undermine a key principle of democracy, the preservation of an even democratic playing field. What we have seen in the police crackdown on 2019 Ganti Presiden is the illiberal repression of democratic opposition. A third issue of concern relates to Jokowi's recent instructions to village-level commands, or Babinsa, TNI commands, as well as to police officers, which suggest that he intends them to function as a campaign instrument in the coming months. In early July, Jokowi delivered a speech in which he instructed Babinsa officers in the lead up to next year's election to put a stop to the spread of hoaxes, such as those associating him with the Indonesian Communist Party. The suspicion is that Jokowi has intention of reactivating the security services for the purposes of partisan campaigning was strengthened with another address to TNI members and police last month. In relation to government programs, he said, "The work that we have carried out, I ask all officers to go and socialize this to the community. Pass on the achievements whenever the moment is right to do so. But President, there is never a right moment to do so." Writing shortly after Jokowi's inauguration, Ed Aspinall and Markus Mitzner described the 2014 election as the most important in the history of post-Suharto democracy. They continued, The choice between Jokowi and Prabowo presented Indonesian voters with the option of maintaining the existing democratic polity or sending it on a path of populist experimentation and neo-authoritarian regression. It is difficult to frame the 2019 election in the same stark terms. Prabowo gave every indication in 2014 that he intended to deliberately and determinedly wind back Indonesian democracy. Jokowi simply showed little interest in such issues. And yet, Jokowi's authoritarian traits have arisen nonetheless, perhaps out of opportunism rather than ideology. While it is important to emphasize that Indonesia has not slipped into a competitive authoritarian state and that we should still expect relatively free elections next year, there is growing evidence that the Jokowi government is taking an authoritarian turn that will further undermine Indonesia's democratic credentials. Finally, I'm being told to wrap up. Let me finish by saying this. Indonesian democracy has remained resilient for 20 years. As next year's elections approach, that resilience will again be tested. It is worth reflecting on what has changed since the previous election cycle. As in 2014, the 2019 election will be a two-horse race. As in 2014, we will have on one side a candidate who styles himself as staunchly nationalistic, anti-leftist, pro-military, and receptive to the further encroachment of conservative religious agendas into the national political arena. His record on the preservation of civil and political rights, his regard for core democratic principles, his commitment to transparent and accountable government and a meaningful rule of law, and his support for an independent anti-corruption agenda are all highly dubious. He will be contesting the presidential election with the support of a grand coalition of parties, a strong grip on the media, and an assembly of political elites whose own democratic and reformist credentials should inspire little confidence from the Indonesian electorate. And on the other side of the ballot paper will be Prabowo Subianto. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. What a cracking paper. What a great audience. Well, I loved all the mms and the ahs. It was such a dramatic paper. So it was a cracking paper. It was such a pleasure to be asked to comment on it. I want to thank the Indonesia Project and in particular the organisers of the Indonesia Update for inviting me to comment on this fine paper. And I take special pleasure in noting that this year is the 20th anniversary of the fall of Suharto, and that on this podium, scholars have charted the fall of Suharto, Indonesia's transition to democratisation, its first democratic elections, the long grind of institutional reform, and the stagnation of that reform effort. Today, building on that intellectual lineage, Tom sounds the alarm for the decline of Indonesia's democracy. Tom's paper was very finely crafted. It was rich in detail, it was robustly evidenced and elegantly written. He has adeptly documented emerging trends that we'll be certainly talking about for the years to come. These trends include the accommodation of anti-pluralist political Islam into national and regional level politics, the challenge to dominant institutions of political representation, and to the struggles of coalition building in the face of the increasing polarisation of Indonesia's political landscape. In this rich account, Tom surveys the year that was to argue that Jokowi's political pragmatism, ever present in his political career, has today been sharpened into a ruthless political instrumentalism. He contends that in the lead up to 2019, President Jokowi is utilising and exacerbating existing deficiencies in the institutional framework in order to actively suppress the political opposition at the national and subnational levels. One example of this is what Tom calls the instrumentalisation of the constitutionally apolitical security and law enforcement institutions, including the military, the Attorney General's Office, the State Intelligence Agency, and my favourite people, the cops, the Indonesian National Police. Even a cursory observer of the politics of policing cannot have failed to notice the relationship between Jokowi and his police, and what Tom has called the open and systematic political instrumentalisation of the police. In my own analysis, I would add and say that this was evident quite early on in Jokowi's term, in his presidential instruction not to pursue cases of corruption in infrastructure and core government projects, in his routine exhortations to the police that they communicate campaign messaging, and in the spikes we have been seeing in the extrajudicial execution of narcotics suspects and petty thieves, particularly and most recently in the lead up to the Asian Games. Tom makes rich contributions here, assiduously documenting the criminalisation of potential coalition partners, including regional level heads in Papua and West Sumatra and the political opposition. The suppression of the 2019 Ganti President movement and the banning of opposition rallies is a matter of concern and has not escaped his scrutiny. These are examples of how the instrumentalisation of the police shape contemporary Indonesian politics. And the result, argues Tom, is that the quality of Indonesia's democracy is regressing. Tom's opening and concluding statements in the paper sound the alarm bells for further democratic backsliding, indicating that further aggression will transform Indonesia's democracy potentially into a hybrid regime that mixes authoritarian and democratic elements. This kind of politics, we can all agree, is certainly bad for democracy. It's true, absolutely true, that Jokowi is not being a very good Democrat. But these observations only provide a piece of the political puzzle, because we might ask ourselves, why have the police, for instance, not been utilised in this way before? These infringements to democratic norms have occurred without any legislative or institutional change. That leads us to ask, why haven't previous presidents or elites resorted to policing the opposition to achieve their political objectives? The answer, I think, is not that previous presidents, like Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono or Megawati, were imbued with greater political restraint or greater democratic sensibility. The democratic rules of the game were no better, no stronger, no more consolidated, and the police were no less political. The answer lies in the fact that the dynamics of political contestation did not require it. That is, the nature of Indonesia's political conflict has not necessitated these strategies of contestation. So to my mind, the instrumentalisation of these institutions, such as the police, are in fact a symptom of the ongoing changes to the dynamics of political contestation in Indonesia, and not a cause. So rather than honing in on Jokowi as a feeble Democrat or a wily instrumentalist, perhaps we can also understand him quite plainly as an incumbent with the same mundane political strategies and objectives as any other. Ditto his political rival, Prabowo Subianto, who, despite having all the characteristics of a master villain, bar that fluffy cat, cannot be blamed for this shift in the dynamics of political contestation. Prabowo might be the face of the political opposition, but he has played a much more subdued role in challenging Jokowi's presidential term than analysts in 2014 predicted. Indeed, as Tom observed in the presidential nomination process, this was an opposition and a set of social forces that for in some months were in search of a presidential challenger. So I'm suggesting, as observers of Indonesian politics, it falls to us to explain both how and, just as importantly, why political contestation is shifting in this way. Why now, and whose interests will be served? Tom's paper makes an excellent contribution to our understanding of how the terms of political conflict are changing. He documents with great rigour the accommodation of both fringe and mainstream Islamic groups to the political centre. He pursues the reverberations of Jakarta's 2017 elections into the recent regional elections and the awkward attempts by the anti-Ahok coalition to form new political alliances and shape the political contest at the provincial level. And he argues while these new political formations have been uneven in their success and butted up as well against the same constraints of money politics and party cartels, their influence can be felt in the dynamics of coalition making and in the politics of political representation. Tom shows how these transformations and their differential effects are occurring also in an increasingly polarised political landscape that elevates majoritarian, illiberal and nationalist discourses in the interests of emerging new elites. But the question remains still, why? Why has political contestation changed in this way? And the answer to this question frames an agenda for future research that goes beyond a simple shorthand of the post-Ahok landscape. Instead, I think we need to pursue a structural line of inquiry by rigorously interrogating, by reading and rereading the rich literature generated for the past 20 years here at this podium in these political and economic updates, and also more broadly across a variety of disciplines contributed by many people in this room. And this literature can shed light on that why, by showing us how the trajectory of Indonesia's political and economic development has generated new social formations, new forms of wealth and precarity, new political subjectivities, new grievances and disenfranchisement, both imagined and real, such they could be so readily harnessed by elites, and bring us to here, to this radically different set of terms under which political conflict must play out. We have the key to why, and it lies here in rigorous historical and social inquiry. This kind of discussion moves us away from ranking Indonesia as a weak democracy, as a political regime of more or less democratic institutions, to focus on the dynamics of political conflict as they are played out within and shaped by existing institutional forms. And in so doing, I think it also opens up fruitful new parallels for comparison, beyond the exceptionalism of Asian political regimes or the special politics of new democracies, to a comparison between political regimes that have been underpinned by similar structural organisation. After all, it's not just Indonesian democracy that has seen transformation in the dynamics of political contestation. We are challenged to explain these political changes as much in the case of Indonesia as we are here in our own country, in this city, as recent events show. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to endorse Jacqui's comment earlier that was a cracker of a paper and a cracker of a response. And I think I'm not doing so well with chairing because we're running very short of question time. But we do have, I think, I'm just checking with Greg, a few minutes. So perhaps we can start with some questions. Just single questions, no long speeches, and we'll take a couple before we actually put responses. So I think somewhere in the middle and somewhere over there. I think there are microphones heading your way. So do we have someone with a microphone and a question? Here we go.
Thank you. My name is Yogi Vidyatama from University of Canberra. I'm here. Tom. So Tom started with the global picture. And I just wonder whether you should or need to align more the global picture and the impact to the Indonesian politics at this moment. Thank you.
And we'll just take a second one before we ask for answers.
Hi. Hi. I'm Nadia, a student at the Australian National University, and I would like to ask a question to Tom about the Islamic identity in Indonesia. To what extent, like, so obviously Islam here is portrayed as like extreme. It's, you know, it has like repression of political parties, and it's portrayed kind of in a negative sense that it's being too extremist. To what extent do you think those religious contentions are just misinterpretations, like exploiting religious values? That's my question.
Great. Do we have a third person with a question? Because maybe we'll take three. Is someone with a microphone? I can't quite see. Ah, over here.
About the 8 months, 8 months towards the election is for Tom. I think I asked this question once when you gave a lecture at Lowy Institute. Now, this 8 months people will spend a lot of money. Now, why is disclosure of pecuniary interest still taboo in Indonesia?
Thank you very much for the questions. So I'll just take them in turn. So the first question was about the global picture and how this connects to the emerging politics of Islam. Is that right? Oh, great. Oh, thanks. Sorry, I just couldn't quite catch the last bit. Thank you. Look, I think that if we look at the sort of the state of democracy globally, Indonesia is by no means unique, and it's by no means doing badly. I mean, really, in sort of global comparative terms, Indonesia has suffered a decline, but not the sort of sharp decline that we see in so many other parts of the world. The question, of course, is to what extent will this sort of pattern of deterioration that we've seen in the past few years actually lead Indonesia towards something like a hybrid regime or a competitive authoritarian regime down the track? The fact that Indonesia has been seen as a beacon of democracy not only in Southeast Asia but around the world for 2 decades, I think should actually make us more alarmed about this decline, where we see systems that have not been able to consolidate its sort of democratic system of government over an extended period. You might see this kind of movements in and out of authoritarianism. But in Indonesia, we've actually got what most political scientists would regard as a consolidated democracy, a consolidated electoral democracy. So if we do see continued deterioration, and if we do see some sort of democratic reversal into authoritarianism, that would be a major blow to the democratic project around the world, I think. So absolutely, I'm all for framing this in sort of global comparative terms. The next question, I believe, was about whether or not Islamic extremist or Islamic hardline Islamic views are being misinterpreted. So I assume that this is a question relating to the views or the doctrinal sort of positions of people who are being integrated into the government and into the administration at the moment. The example that we sort of spoke about earlier of Ma'ruf Amin, I think is instructive here. Ma'ruf is very much from the conservative end of NU. He is certainly not representative as far as I can see of the sort of the middle ground, and I'm sure that if you're interested in his sort of ideology position, you can read a piece written by Greg Feely on New Mandala very recently. But the question is, to what extent is he actually able to exert influence over the administration? To what extent are his own religious positions, his own doctrines likely to sway Jokowi's administration towards perhaps a less tolerant, less pluralistic sort of mode of operation in future? Let's imagine a situation in which an issue such as the Ahmadiyya or Shia or gay rights flares up and Ma'ruf Amin makes some kind of controversial comment to the media. If he comes out and says homosexuals should be imprisoned, right? I think that by his standards is actually quite a moderate position to take. If he said that, what would Jokowi do? I mean, could Jokowi come out and actually disagree with him publicly? Could he just let that issue sit? Or would he be forced, in fact, to, through this process of accommodation, take on elements of those ideas that Ma'ruf may put forward? We're even seeing at the moment, a concerted effort to crack down on sexual freedom in Indonesia in the ongoing discussions around the KUHP, the criminal code. So my concern is that the penetration of individuals like Ma'ruf Amin and CS would be potentially very damaging to Indonesia's pluralist credentials once they are in the corridors of power and once they have a platform from which to sort of express those views and beliefs. And the final question was about the money leading up to the campaign. Why no disclosure of pecuniary interests? Well, I mean, as far as I can see, there has never been any transparency in Indonesia about campaign expenditure. I think in 2014, the Jokowi campaign reported an expenditure of around about 30 million Australian dollars, and the Prabowo campaign a little over half that. Those numbers were, as far as I can see, this is opinion, but those numbers seem to be completely fictitious. There's no correspondence to reality there. I think that campaign financing for the presidential campaign specifically will be a major issue in this election. And I think it goes a long way to explaining why Prabowo actually decided on Sandiaga during the vice presidential nominations. In Jakarta, which was Prabowo's coalition managing to defeat an incumbent backed by the government, his own expenditure reportedly was extremely small. So a very senior member of his campaign team said that they could not get 4 billion rupiah out of him, which is what, $400,000 Australian, that he was not willing to actually put that money into the campaign. And that the person who funded the campaign, at least 80% of the campaign, to put this person's figure on it, was Sandi. Sandi's basically responsible for the entire funding of the Jakarta campaign. So in terms of campaign finance, I think that is a big issue, but we're not going to ever get much clarity on how much people are spending and where that money's going.
Okay. Apologies, everyone. I think we're about to trespass into morning tea time, so you'll have to save your questions for later in the day. So morning tea will be outside here. So thank you, everyone, for such an interesting session.